I believe this is the most important parable that Jesus ever told. Now, I know some people might argue that, well, it really is the prodigal son, or it really should be the story of the Good Samaritan. And I would agree those are important and they are life-changing if we really take them in. But today, in our time, this is the story that we need to hear. Because Jesus tries again and again to compare this kingdom of God that he is hoping will be the way that we live on earth as it is in heaven, to things that people understood. So he asks them, what if we say someone planted some really good seed in their field, and then their enemy came along and planted weeds among that wheat, and then slipped away, and the plants began to grow, and as they grew, you could see that the grain was sprouting and the weeds were coming up as well. And so the workers who worked that field went to their master and said, where did all these weeds come from? And the owner said, an enemy seems to have done this. And the servants asked again then, well, don't you want us to really weed this garden? Get rid of all of the bad plants? His reply was no. No, in trying to do that, in gathering the weeds, you would uproot the wheat along with them. So we will let them grow together until the harvest time. Then the reapers will collect the weeds first and bind them in bundles, and then gather the good wheat. Now, the weeds in this story are believed to be a plant that would have been recognizable at the time called darnel, or a false wheat. And this wheat is not harmless, it's poisonous. They mimic the look of the good, nourishing grain, but they are not, for they can cause illness, even death when ingested. So this actually was a dangerous proposition, to leave poisonous weeds throughout a field with the possibility that they might choke out the good grain. So what was this landowner thinking? The servants, they were good and diligent and enthusiastic workers. They wanted to just do their job. They wanted to fix the problem fast, identify and destroy the bad seed before it could cause any harm. But the story isn't about plants. It's about us. It's about people and communities. It's about churches and synagogues. It's about cities and nations. It's about the good and the evil that exists in our world and in ourselves, all mixed together. Debbie Thomas speaks our thoughts, I think, when she says, like the servants, I tend to lead with confidence rather than humility when it comes to moral gardening. Jesus, trust me, I know how to separate the weeds from the wheat. Just let me at it, please. I'll have this field cleared in no time. Why wait? Let's settle the question of who is good and who is bad and who belongs and who doesn't. But Jesus says no and wait, and insists on patience and humility and restraint when it comes to patrolling the borders of this precious field. And even as we acknowledge the reality of evil, he asks us to accept God's timing instead of ours when it comes to destroying what is evil. But why? Because as Barbara Brown Taylor puts it, God knows that the business of discernment is much harder than we think it is. Turn us loose with a machete, and there is no telling what we will chop down and what we will spare. But actually there is. Actually, we know what will happen. We have seen it. We have seen it in Auschwitz, and we have seen it in Rwanda, among many other awful places and times when humans believe they can do the moral weeding in this world. It always ends in tragedy. Erwin Staub was a child in Hungary. He was saved from the Nazi death camps by his caretaker, Maria Gogin. And while protecting the children, her life was saved from a firing squad by a well-respected Hungarian Nazi who saw what was happening and told the others to stop. Irvin survived and went on to study psychology and developed a theory of how genocide comes about. As leaders spread hateful ideologies and as people get used to ostracizing others, hostility between groups slowly evolves into violence. 50 years after Maria saved Irvin's life, he was hearing about another unfolding disaster, this time in the East African country of Rwanda. Just as the Nazis had portrayed the Jews as subhuman, the Rwandan government, dominated by the Hutu group, dehumanized the Tutsi minority. Their weapon of choice was radio, hate radio. One popular radio station mixed popular music with hours and hours of venomous lies, labeling all Tutsis as cockroaches. An extremist newspaper printed a list of Hutu 10 Commandments, which included lies about the Tutsis. The broadcast had a very real effect. One study calculated that hate radio convinced 50,000 people to murder their neighbors. By the time the Hutu government was defeated, the country was in ruins. At least 1 million people had been murdered. The majority of the Tutsi population was dead. This media campaign convinced once friendly neighbors that it was their patriotic duty to kill their acquaintances and friends because of their ethnic background, which is basically what happened in Nazi Germany. Government-supported media labeled Jewish people as evil, as vermin, as insects that needed to be extinguished until enough people believed it. And then if everyone you knew around you believed it, well, then it must be true and they must have deserved to die. So we know what happens when we decide to weed the moral garden. And it's not to say that we should ignore evil, but it is to say that we should move gently and with great care, recognizing that our task is to grow the good, not to burn the bad. Irvin Staub and other researchers have discovered 3 important factors in preventing this kind of violence. They realize that violence evolves slowly. It's not a sudden loss of consciousness. It grows in times of uncertainty when people are afraid, and it is groomed with dehumanizing language. They also discovered that bystanders matter. When a society begins to harm some group, the only thing that can stop it are active bystanders. And the third they realized was connection. They found that when people form close personal relationships with people from other groups that are different from themselves, this provides a barrier to the spread of prejudice that leads to violence. So our words matter. The language that we hear and use is powerful. In a world that is divided by fear and anger, just looking for a target, for a scapegoat, for someone to blame, you are the bystanders. When you hear anyone using dehumanizing labels from either side, from any side, you can say, wait. You can say, let's stop and consider what is really happening here. What are the problems and the issues that are causing the pain? In the aftermath of the Rwandan tragedy, Irvin Staub and the newly elected officials wanted to prove that if radio could convince people to be violent, then that same media could also bring people together. They developed a radio show with the purpose of bringing enemies together, something of a soap opera that would rebuild friendships, that would foster reconciliation, that would rebuild a country. And slowly, their efforts began to bear good fruit. When we believe that it is our job to weed out the bad seed, we become the bad seed. We destroy what is good in the process. It is our job, our place, our purpose to grow the good. To grow the good with whatever means or media we have available. To grow the good with our words and our actions. This week, we said goodbye to someone who taught us how to tend our moral garden carefully, lovingly, trusting God and that long moral arc of history to bear the fruit of justice. Watching this week on the news, really 2 weeks past, particularly on Facebook feeds, the people who had selfies with John Lewis came from every walk of life, even just the ones that I saw in my feed, in my friends and their friends, whether they were women or men, whether they were black or white, whether they were straight or gay, whether they were conservative or liberal. I had a picture with John Lewis, someone who cared and took the time to say hello to the people around him, to show that little bit of attention and kindness. John Lewis came to believe early in life that nonviolent civil disobedience was the way to change lives, minds, hearts, and the world. He wrote, like so many young people today, I was searching for a way out, or some might say a way in, and then I heard the voice of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. on an old radio. He was talking about the philosophy and the discipline of nonviolence. He said, we are all complicit when we tolerate injustice. He said it's not enough to say it will get better by and by. He said each of us has a moral obligation to stand up, to speak out. When you see something that is not right, you must say something. You must do something. And he wrote to us all, in my life, I have done all I can to demonstrate that the way of peace, the way of love and nonviolence is the more excellent way. And now it's your turn to let freedom ring. So I say to you, walk with the wind, brothers and sisters, and let the spirit of peace and the power of everlasting love be your guide. John Lewis loved people with his full attention. He forgave the past and understood the social forces that lead otherwise good people into acts of oppression and violence and indifference. He showed us how to love in the face of hate. He was truly a follower of Jesus and a prophet of justice, building up the beloved community until he took his last breath. And for that we are grateful. And we understand and we know and we share the joyful truth that Jesus invites everyone into the beloved community with an unconditional welcome to the table to share the gift of love. So we come together to reaffirm this truth, and today we reaffirm God's commitment to us and our commitment to care for one another with a simple meal of a piece of bread, a sip of juice, a symbol of our identity as followers of the way of Christ. The church began with the sharing of bread shared as a symbol of life given up, standing for the truth of God's compassionate concern for all. So we continue to share this bread together in remembrance of this life that was given, the life of Christ given so that we might know God's power of redeeming love, given so that we can know the forgiveness of sins, and given so that we can be empowered to forgive as we have been forgiven, and empowered to do something and to say something for justice, for God's just and loving kingdom on earth as it is in heaven.